Now it's okay.
So, okay. So welcome everyone. So we're starting one more lecture in our political science seminar series. And today we have the honor to receive Professor Tímea Drinócvzi. And so I would like to thank very much for being here with us. And I would like to also make a special thank you to Professor Magna Inácio, who invited Professor Tímea Drinócvzi. So it's a pleasure to host you here in this seminar series. This is before the last, so we're almost concluding and the next seminar series will be in the 11th of February. So we're about to conclude the year of 2021. So I'll briefly introduce Professor Tímea, and then she will talk, and then we'll have time for Q&A after that. So Professor Tímea Drinócvzi is a visiting professor at the Faculty of Law at UFMG and the Doctor of Academy of Sciences of Hungary. Professor Drinócvzi served as a full professor at the University of Pécs, Faculty of Law, Hungary, and professor at Kenyatta University School of Law in Nairobi, Kenya. She has been a visiting professor in law schools in Czech Republic, Poland, Germany, Croatia, and Turkey. She has studied in graduate and undergraduate programs in Hungary, Kenya, and Brazil, where her teaching activity has covered Hungarian and Kenyan constitutional law, European constitutional law, quality of legislation, social foundations of law, legal research, and writing. Professor Drinócvzi is an independent expert in the Office of Democratic Institutions and the Human Rights Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. She is also the author and editor of several books in Hungarian, recent co-edited book in English, Rule of Law, Common Values and Illiberal Constitutionalism, Poland and Hungary within the European Union, was published in September of 2021, so very new book by Routledge. And her newest co-authored book, also published by Routledge, was Illiberal Constitutionalism in Poland and Hungary, the deterioration of democracy, misuse of human rights, and abuse of the rule of law. So very interesting trajectory, very interesting areas of study, and we look forward to listening to you. Thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ricardo and Magna, for organizing this seminar series and inviting me to this session to talk about illiberalism and illiberal constitutionalism. These two topics are obviously interrelated, and today they offer a new emerging research field for scholars and researchers from any subset of social sciences. The emerging scholarly interest on illiberalism has already recognized that it is a complex phenomenon, and as such, any scholarly inquiry on it would require an interdisciplinary approach. That is why I'm very glad that I, a scholar with a constitutional law background, can be here with you today. And let me tell you that it is always challenging to talk about your research for an audience that is outside of your immediate discipline. So regardless of how close they could or should be, like in the case of law and political science. So let me try to share my screen because I made a presentation for you, and let me just please know if you can see it.
It's okay, we can see it.
Yeah, and oops, do I need to relocate these photos?
No, it's looking good here.
Looking good. Okay, fine. So I'm trying to, yeah, okay, it was like that. So thank you so much for the introduction. I tried to talk like 45 minutes or 50. I cannot make any promises that I will be like shorter, maybe a little bit longer. This presentation will be. So the topics, as I said, illiberalism and illiberal constitutionalism. So here you can see two, yeah. Here you can see what I would consider the state of the art on the studies on illiberalism as of basically today, more or less. We have this Routledge Handbook of Illiberalism, edited by András Sajor and Alois and Stephen Holmes. And this book was published last year in November. And there will be another book, Oxford Handbook of Illiberalism, edited by Marlene Laurel, and this is a forthcoming book. And Marlene Laurel has already published an article about, you can see it in the middle, Illiberalism, a Conceptual Introduction, in April last year. So when I'm talking about illiberalism, I will draw on these works, okay? And when I'm talking about illiberal constitutionalism, I will obviously talk about our books, which I edited and co-edited and co-authored with Agnieszka Bienkatsala. I'm Hungarian, and Agnieszka Bienkatsala is a Polish professor. Probably you remember that the first book was published in 2020 this year, and 2021 in September, we published our book on illiberal constitutionalism. And when I'm talking about illiberal constitutionalism, I will draw on the content of this book and how we try to conceptualize this illiberal constitutionalism. But first, maybe a little introduction to the structure of these books. Obviously, the Routledge Handbook, you can have a look at it in the internet as well. It is at the website of the publishing house. And this is the table of content here. And because you have access, I would not want to go into details. You can see that the handbook covers a lot of areas. And to which you don't have access right now is what the Oxford Handbook of Illiberalism would be about. Now, you can see it here. It's a kind of table of content. As I said, it is a forthcoming book. It's not ready yet, obviously. So you can see some similarities between the coverage of the two books. And let me here just very briefly refer to some ideas. So when the conceptual discussion is made in the Oxford Handbook, it would focus on also the relationship between illiberalism and populism and authoritarianism. When it is about the intersectionalities, it will also include certain chapters on demographic concerns and the variety of phobias. When it is about illiberal practices and power, it would include chapters on illiberalism in the global south, illiberal constitutionalism in East Central Europe, and illiberalism during the pandemic. The grassroots culture and activism would include thoughts and papers about anthropology, media consumption, and there will be some chapters about American, French, Russian, Polish thinkers, and also the role which Russia and China plays in the illiberal order. Right. So this is how these scholars who contribute to these handbooks and the editors of the handbooks see what illiberalism is or how it could be conceptualized. Now, when you read things about illiberalism, basically these works I mentioned, you realize that there is an agreement. There is an agreement on certain things, and there is no agreement on other things. So let me quickly talk about just on which they seem to agree. First and foremost, that further research are needed in almost every field, and also that illiberalism does not refer to a particular regime, because illiberalism can emerge everywhere. It does not equal with neoliberalism, with non-liberalism, but it is a form of post-liberalism and has something to do with the people left behind. it is strongly connected to democratic backsliding, conservatism, and populism. And then there is also an agreement on why the term has been avoided so far in the literature. This is because if you put the adjective illiberal to nouns like constitutionalism or democracy, everybody would think that that you are working with oxymoron. And the other reason is this is that in disciplines, especially in political science, other expressions have been traditionally used to describe the phenomenon, which we now try to grasp like illiberalism. And the usual terms are like hybrid regime, competitive authoritarianism, democratic backsliding, democratization, populist authoritarianism. But then it turns out that these terms right now are not really adequate terms to describe the phenomenon. Also, which I already mentioned, that an interdisciplinary approach is needed because the tools of our own discipline could be ineffective to understand what illiberalism is. So it seems that the literature agrees on this, and then they don't agree on what it is. So there is an opinion about that it is a theory, but then there is a question whether it is a coherent theory, or is it a new ideological family, or can it be not necessarily a coherent theory, but a connected set of values, a conglomerate of connected set of values. Others think that it is not a theory. It is just a set of abusive practices from the perspective of liberal democracy, understanding of these abusive practices does not need theory at all. So that's why there are opinions which are saying that it is not a theory. So there is no agreement about its connection to liberalism. So one opinion is saying that it is an antithesis of liberalism, and the other is saying that it is not diametrically opposed to liberalism. And here, just one example, if you have a look at democratic backsliding, there is no agreement whether illiberalism precedes democratic backsliding, or democratic backsliding is the thing which contributes to illiberalism. So this is shows us, I think, that it is a research topic which is fantastic and very complex. And as the complexity, if I can just, yes, the complexity of it, I just want to show you some definitions. Okay, so the Conceptual Introduction, this short article written by Marlene Laura, for her, illiberalism is a new ideological family bound together in an oppositional position vis-a-vis liberalism. It does not necessarily make up a coherent ideology, but represent an interconnected set of values that come together in a country-specific pattern. It seems to often merge with the call to restore sovereignty in every possible arena, like international, political, economic, and culture. Illiberalism is a product for those who have been left behind, a genuine revival of conservative values by those determined to reject multiculturalism and gradual erosion of so-called traditional cultural norms. It is a reaction to globalization that touches both established democracies and developing countries, where state and markets have failed to address social injustice. And she draws attention to the fact that now in the literature, the verb illiberalism is used, and not the adjective illiberal, And it has advantages because now no one can blame no one to use oxymorons. Also, for her, it focuses on an ideological component, which means that there is no confusion anymore with institutional and constitutional assumptions about a political regime. If we have a look at the Routledge Handbook, now we can see that according to the editors, illiberalism is not an ideology, not a regime type, not synonymous with autocracy and totalitarianism, because it is compatible with the rituals of competitive democracy. You can see for them what illiberalism refer to, and this is one approach to try to define illiberalism. And on the other hand, there is another definition, which is the socially, mentally, and culturally entrenched pattern with democracy. And they also indicate the source of illiberalism. You can see it here. There are other definitions also in the handbook. And it could be seen as a political categorization and moral condemnation, and also response, particular response as well, and also as a set of contemporary political practices of government and social relations. So you can also here, I think that at this moment you can feel that there are still many variations of the definition based on the discipline, I think, which is within which particular authors are investigating and interrogating illiberalism. When it is used as a illiberalism, when it is used as a regime type, it refers to the effective democracy and different form of authoritarian regimes. And in the handbook, they express the view that there is no need for an illiberal theory of constitutionalism, because even without it, illiberal leaders can abuse democratic constitutions, and we can examine these illiberal practices with the existing tools. And thirdly, there is no illiberal constitution or constitutional design emerged, and there is no vision of new vision of constitutional review. The handbook also adds that in illiberal political regimes, evidence-based rational arguments are replaced with emotionalism and identity boosting. Therefore, the standard irrational source of illiberalism is identified in the fear of status loss, pride by identification with a group, and manipulation of existential fear. So this is just a brief and quick overview of illiberalism as the state of the art. The handbook is really fascinating. At least had really long. I couldn't read everything, obviously. And here I just wanted to show you just the surface, you know. But I invite you to read that handbook, and also, if it is published, the other as well. So now about my co-authored book and the concept of illiberal constitutionalism. It was a research project, and we wanted to have answers to these three questions, which you can see here. So we started to examine and compare Hungary and Poland from a constitutional law perspective around 14 and 15. And you know that since by then, authors and scholars have already tried to conceptualize or identify what exactly this Hungarian constitutional system is, or political system is. When the PiS party in Poland won the election in 2015, the Poles were very concerned too, because they have already seen what is going on in Hungary. And so we started the research. And as I said, that by that time, you could read in the literature some categorization of Hungary, and obviously they related it also to Poland. And in these last 6 years, many books and articles have been produced trying to identify what it is exactly, Hungary and Poland. So what we felt is also that it is there is obviously a deterioration, but that is obviously a gradual process. And what we were like really interested in is that how could the people support this kind of system? And why we asked this question here, whether it is really authoritarian, is because now, when we screen the literature, we could see that mainly constitutional scholars, when they try to understand what is going on in Hungary and Poland, they used authoritarianism, autocracy. No one used constitutionalism. And we were interested in why it is so. And we were a little bit surprised why we are like our constitutional system, like Polish and the Hungarian constitutional system, why it's being called authoritarian. And they usually, and also you can see here other authors, how they call what based on what conceptual framework, and when they publish their works as well, because that is also important and interesting. So we just simply read what they wrote, and we realized that now we are like grouped together with Turkey and Russia, because a new concept, modern authoritarianism, emerged. And then when you read the works on that, you can see that Poland and Hungary more or less like put that. So what we did, we had a look at two indices. And why we did that? Because we wanted to comprehensively study the opinions of others, not only the opinion in the literature. And we appreciated the variety of methodology and different research results of these most important indices which we used. We used also the World Justice Project, the Rule of Law Index, but I didn't want to put it here for you. Now it is in the book. So we use them mainly because of three reasons. Because first, we wanted to see how far Hungary and Poland went in their illiberalization process. And second, because we needed to compare these figures or their figures on Hungary and Poland with that of other states, with which Hungary and Poland are usually associated in the literature, like as a modern authoritarian state, as I said, Russia, Turkey, and with other states like Hong Kong and Singapore, because the description of these states in the literature use the term hybrid constitutionalism and authoritarian constitutionalism, respectively. And third reason was that it's not a reason, but a kind of like explanation and a kind of excuse as well, that there is no agreement in the literature on how to establish a reliable distinction between liberal democracy and electoral autocracy. So what we did, we just had a look at, looked at the figures and realized that we are not there yet, right? So it is a summary here. And we are not there yet, like Hungary and Poland. There is one exception, but that shows obviously the gradual deterioration here, because in a VDEM index, Hungary in 2020 was labeled as an illiberal autocracy, and this is the exception. And also the Bertelsmann index, if you see the democracy versus autocracy index, Hungary is at the threshold, but it also indicates that we are not there yet from this perspective, okay? And this was very important for us, because here we could argue that, as I said, we are not there yet. Another approach which we used when we tried to understand what's going on, or what had been going on in Hungary and Poland, was that we reflected on the regional context, the gradualness of the deterioration, the methods and content of the changes. And as I said, we took a kind of holistic view on different indices. And based on these, we proposed that Hungary and Poland had developed a new kind of constitutionalism. And for being able to describe it adequately, we introduced this new term, illiberal constitutionalism. Here, I would like to focus on the line on emotion and values, because what we did, we also connected comparative constitutional law and social psychology, narrative psychology, and historical accounts, and used studies on value orientations, explaining the difference between value orientations of people living in Western societies and Central and Eastern Europe. It helped us to understand a little bit better why people still seem to support, or at least do not oppose, populist autocrats and their policies, in the sense that people tend to be comfortable with the system in which they find themselves. People, I'm talking about Hungary and Poland all the time, okay? People behaved in the same manner during and after the democratic transition in 1989 and 1990. They welcomed systemic changes towards democracy, constitutional democracy. They supported them, felt comfortable, until they got receptive to the complete opposite, to the extent that we have been experiencing since 2010 in Hungary and 2015 in Poland. Here, I would want to show you two slides about this type of researches, the research results, okay? And what I will be talking about later will be the constitutive elements of illiberal constitutionalism, okay? So now, based on these value orientation researches, this is the difference between not Western values, but values which is considered more important, less important in Western societies, and also the same goes to societies in Eastern Europe, right? So this is a very important difference in our view. And so this respect of hierarchy, that is very important. And we, you see, we attribute less appreciation to achievement and initiative and so on and so forth. The other is, the other slide is about our compromised self-confidence, which is exploited by an autocratic and populist leader. And here it shows that we have a tendency toward authoritarianism and conservatism. We are willing to trade off liberal and democratic values, and we are in need of strong leader because we have a desire for stability. So all of this showed us that that we have a kind of unbalanced constitutional identity, which can be and which were exploited by, as I said, authoritarian and populist leader. So now I would want to give you a definition of illiberal constitutionalism, drawing on what we consider the context, values, emotions, history, and what else? The gradualness of the deterioration. So it is an authoritarianization process of EU member states. And obviously we have to have this type of leaders. It happens right now. It's a contemporary phenomenon. And it is there is a deterioration of substantive constitutional democracy and hollowing out of its components. And what are the components of constitutional democracy? I will show you in the next slides, but I can tell you right now. So it is like rule of law, which is transformed to be liberal legality in the liberal constitutionalism. The second component of constitutional democracy is democracy, which transformed to be illiberal democracy. And as for human rights protection, which is the third element of constitutional democracy, we can see the illiberalization of human rights. And another component of our definition relates to this unbalanced constitutional identity, that it says that illiberal constitutionalism retains a constitutionalist structure. We try to prove it by using the indexes and also by trying to distinguish our definition from other definitions I will show you later, and the combination of an unbalanced constitutional identity and a charismatic leader. And I showed you why we think that this is the case, because we relied on the research results of other area of social science. So this is how we conceptualize what constitutional democracy is. As I said, this is what we developed after the transition. And now in illiberal constitutionalism, you have the same thing, but with an alteration of content, right? And this happens through an illiberalization process with a member state of the European Union. And I have to emphasize this fact that in our case, it is very important because the EU law and certain international human rights commitments could be considered as a constraint of public power, which is important for being called constitutionalism or constitutionalist system. So going back now to, because that was constitutional democracy, going back to our my topic right now. So what is it exactly, this illiberal constitutionalism, and why we can call something which is like constitutionalism and democracy to be illiberal, is or is not it an oxymoron? And how can we differentiate this from other terms which I use to describe Hungary, Poland? And what is illiberalism in this context? So first, I would talk about this oxymoron, not oxymoron thing. We use illiberal to qualify both constitutionalism and one of its components, which is democracy. When we wrote the book, the illiberal component of our terms had not really been explored in the literature. So we published the book last year, and we submitted in 2 years ago, so we worked on it like before, right? So these terms have not been explored in the literature because the term illiberal constitutionalism itself, connected to Poland and Hungary, has not been contested with arguments that go beyond mere denial. Instead of illiberal democracy, scholars proposed expressions such as competitive of modern authoritarian regime and other labels. For these constitutional scholars, constitutionalism and democracy are intrinsically liberal, and it cannot be anything else. They also seem to use democracy to cover everything that is good, including, for instance, human rights and justice. I think that for those who believe that constitutionalism and democracy cannot be disentangled for liberalism, our concept of illiberal constitutionalism and illiberal democracy remains an oxymoron and an incomprehensive concept, which is at the same time also misleading and capable of legitimizing an undemocratic system. However, I also think, and this is why we wrote the book, what supports the use of the term is the possibility of disentangling the constitutionalism and liberalism and democracy and liberalism, the consideration of emotions and values, as I explained, the gradualness of the deterioration, and the context that it is like, Hungary and Poland is still a member state of the European Union, and we had like 55 years of substantive constitutional democracy, or if you want, liberal constitutionalism. So this binary nature of constitutionalism is predominantly an American scholarly view. So when something does not resemble to liberal constitutionalism, it is authoritarianism or something else. We view constitutionalism a little bit differently, as we, Hungarians and Poles, received constitutionalism as a package. It resulted from the transition. So we, similarly to other non-American scholars, prefer to refer to the constitutionalism that emerged in 1989 and 1990 as a constitutional democracy, which embodies the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. I just showed you the illustration for that. In our region, where constitutional development has been continually disrupted, democracy and liberalism and constitutionalism did not need to fight for prevalence, addressing issues arising in this region without considering this difference, in our mind, would lead to a simplified and restricted understanding of the recent constitutional remodeling. And that is why I'm trying to explain for what constitutional democracy means for us and why we prefer the use of constitutional democracy. And when I refer to we and us, it includes my co-author, Agnieszka Bianca-Sala, and myself. Okay? So another thing here, important, that we should not forget that disentangling constitutionalism and liberalism is not unprecedented and unheard of in the literature. Consider the works on non-liberal constitutionalism, authoritarian constitutionalism, semi-liberal constitutionalism, or hybrid constitutionalism. So we proposed that the term constitutionalism could be seen as less of an ideology and more of a constitutional design that could accommodate various political moralities, philosophies, or practices, especially in those states in which liberal constitutionalism has already been present as a political ideology and a constitutional design, like in Hungary and Poland. So let me just show you how we separated our term from what? This us, or US is not US, but it's us, right? So our concept. As I said, and if you remember in this table, you could see that there is more authoritarianism with different adjectives. This is how they label Hungary and Poland. And basically, what we are saying when we try to differentiate us from competitive authoritarianism and the others is that the constitutional changes that has been experienced in Hungary and Poland do not necessarily fit into these categories because of the indices. You can see the starting point of the deterioration because we are deteriorating from liberal democracy, and also there is this possibility, in our view, to disentangle liberalism and constitutionalism and democracy. So because of these factors, we argue in the book that we can separate illiberal constitutionalism from these concepts. And here the same applies basically here as well, especially in the field of polity and the nature of elections, and also in the issue of normative commitment to constraints on public power appears here, and this remains with us in the next slide as well. I don't really want to read out these slides. I think that you already had opportunity to screen it. So here, as for the constraint on public power, which is important for the term constitutionalism, we can see here in this slide two not distinct form of constitutionalism, yet they are using the term, especially in connection with abusive constitutionalism. Detecting a commitment to constraint on public power is challenging, even though this commitment, as I said, seems to be necessary for using the term constitutionalism. As for the last term, abusive legalism and autocratic legalism, these terms describe the method of autocratic leaders and how they learn from one another, and they do not really describe the constitutional system. And we in the book, we wanted to describe our constitutional system, wanted to say something about the constitutional system and try to conceptualize what it is. So, so now, what the illiberal or illiberalism is in this context, in our context, Hungary and Poland. In our book, we explain what we mean under illiberal and illiberalism, but we focused on the constitutional remodeling, as I said, and just briefly referred to its use in economic and social sphere. You can see how others define this during the time of the research, or our research, right? And how we use illiberal. Illiberal in the term illiberal constitutionalism nor entails a coherent political philosophy, despite the attempts in works written by pro-government scholars. I just refer here to these adventures with political constitutionalism. Instead, what we see here is a patchwork of some components of some political philosophy, like communitarianism, conservatism, political realism, pragmatism, neoliberalism, and nationalism as an ideology. All of them are heavily influenced and determined by right-wing populism and identity politics in our case. And in our case, the adaptive ground for these, as we see and as I tried to show you very briefly, is the unbalanced constitutional identity of Poles and Hungarians. We base this view, as I said, on our history, emotional trajectory revealed by studies of narrative psychology and research on value and value orientation of people of our region and other regions in Europe. We, Poles and Hungarians, exhibit an illiberal value orientation. Historically, we desire to reach a genuine independence and sovereignty. Therefore, we are more receptive to an authoritarian leader, paternalism, clientelism, nationalism, and we are also more permissive with corruption. Historically, the coincidence of a historical moment of unbalanced identity and the emergence of an illiberal and charismatic leader has shown more durability, both in Hungary and Poland, than the liberal constitutional period after the transition. It might be assumed that there is a historically held belief and applied practice that these countries are better run if there is a charismatic leader whose charisma is more important than their ideology due to the unbalanced constitutional identity. What is important for us when we use illiberal as an adjective in front of legality democracy is that it is a kind of twisted meaning of rule of law and the democracy, and illiberal legality means this nationalistic, over-politicized conceptualization of the rule of law, and in other aspects, it resembles to a rule of law, but it is not really the rule of law. So it retains a formal legality, more or less, and also it appears in the application and enforcement of the EU law, but not necessarily the value part of the EU law. That is why we have these proceedings or procedures against us and issues with the rule of law conditionality, because there is an issue with the rule of law, obviously. But what this illiberal legality wants to express is that the European rule of law, it can be seen as a kind of constraint, because what European rule of law is a kind of, it's a rule of law concept emerged in Europe based on our tradition and history. And it also comprises a particular political theory which demands the prevention of any arbitrary use of power with all its necessary preconditions and implementation mechanisms. This is also a legally enforceable concept that is present in the national constitutions and in the European legal order. And it also requires the domestic law to bear some specific content. And that is why it is a limitation, or it can be seen as a limitation on the domestic political decision maker. So this is the particularity of the EU law. Illiberal democracy is conceptualized as a formal, manipulated, profoundly majoritarian, and non-inclusive democracy in which constitutional institutions such as elections and connected electoral rights and principles, representation, accountability, and the central tenets of democratic lawmaking are to a certain extent misused, abused, or neglected. And also we are experiencing the illiberalization of human rights, which you can see here. And what is interesting is that all of these, which I just listed, illiberal legality and the other two, they appear in formal and informal constitutional changes in both Hungary and Poland. Formal changes more in Hungary, informal more in Poland. The most important examples of the existence of the Hungarian fundamental law with its 9 amendments as to the formal change. But as for the rule of law, we can consider the changes in the relationship between the EU law and domestic law and judicial independence. And as for democracy, we can be reminded to the reforms on elections and electoral bodies. And for human rights, for instance, the anti-LGBTQ constitutional amendments in Hungary and the abortion decision of the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland, which all of them alters the previously understood constitutional content. And it apparently it is stable because what happened since 2010, as you know, we had 3 governments of Viktor Orban, and we will have the election this April. And they achieved constitutional majority during these elections. Elections have been gradually more and more manipulated, of course, but they lost some seats here and there in local elections, and this is also true for Poland. When PiS won, they never got constitutional majority, but they won election twice, and they lost the Senate, and also they lost some seats in local elections. So this is it. These last couple of sentences were just to show you that it seems that this illiberal constitutionalism could demand stability, but we have to wait and see what will happen in April and in this year in Hungary and in the following election in Poland, how the people would react and what would they do. And also we have to wait to see how these new mechanisms of the European Union would work out and what they could do in somehow giving a remedy to the rule of law backsliding, and then in this case only the rule of law backsliding. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. And when you ask questions, please consider the differences between our disciplines. So I will try to do my best to answer to your questions. So thank you.
Thank you for this very insightful and great presentation. So many things to think of. I have a couple of questions, but I would like to open for other people to start asking questions. I know that there were a few. Let me just check the chat first. I think João Paulo Nicolini wants to ask a question. Can you start, João, please?
Should I ask here or write down in the chat?
I think you can just, it's written in the chat, but if you can just read it,
okay.
It makes it easier for everybody to follow.
So thanks, Professor, for your explanation. It was really insightful. I'd like to raise a question about international affairs, because I'm not an expert on Hungary politics, but as far as I know, China established a new university in Hungary. As long as I know, it's the biggest one in the European continent, while Orban has reduced the autonomy of local university in academic terms. So I would like to know about how do you see the role of great powers such as China and Russia in the spread and the support of illiberal administration in a period that the United States has reduced its participation in the global affairs?
Thank you, João Paulo. As I said, the boundaries of discipline, I'm trying to answer to your question. I think that there is at least 2 questions in your question. The first is that the role of China-Russia in the spread of illiberal practices. I'm not sure whether you want to ask whether they gave us practices. This is the spread, because if it is the question or something, then what I read was that there are 2 positions on that. The first is saying that they have a major role in imposing these practices, And the second says that it is not proof that they have a role, because these illiberal leaders, like the Hungarian prime minister, can do it by himself. So there are at least two more or less opposing opinions which I read about this matter. Imposing, right? I think that there is another issue here, whether these illiberal leaders get inspired by. So I feel the difference here, like imposing and get inspired by, right? And yes, get inspired by applies, yes. As for, yes, you know it right. They invited the Fudan, yes, university, and they are making room for them. And they taking away possibility from Hungarian students to have hostels in the area, for instance, because they are relocating the territory to this new university. And it is interesting, yes, that they are inviting Fudan University, and they are kicking out the Central European University. And yes, you are right as well. And you know it it's a correct knowledge to have about the what is going on with the universities in Hungary. They are just basically they are privatized to the hands of loyals and oligarchs. And so we are losing our as a citizen, we are losing our property, actually, right? Because previously they were like state universities with all of the everything, infrastructure, lands, facilities, and now they belong to a foundation run by those oligarchs and loyal persons to the government. Yeah.
So the next person is Lucas Veloso.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Professor Tímea. Thank you so much for your brilliant presentation. I loved your concept of illiberal constitutionalism, very promising, but I will need to study it more carefully before I ask some questions. But the question I had now has to do with the democratic quality indexes that I think you analyzed, such as VDEN and Freedom House. I would like to hear more from you, if possible, about your view of those indexes, the strengths and limitations in the sense of measuring the concepts that you propose, as well as others of concepts of crisis and democratic erosion that you worked on. I asked this because we received recently Professor Sheibub here, and he seemed to us that he's not a big fan of them, especially because of the way they generate the data. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucas. I think it's a very, very important question. Obviously, it is one of the weaknesses of what we do, and because there are, I mean, yeah, how can I say, our concept is just nice, and we still think that is applicable, but obviously we understand the limitations. The limitations comes when you try to use other disciplines with which you are not really familiar with, but which you have to use, but you are not doing that discipline, you are doing your own discipline. So from a constitutional law perspective, this is how we wanted to approach the topic. And the indexes for us were just a tool. But you are right, there are limitations, but we decided not to deal with the limitations, because what we wanted to see is that the figures actually and the labels, that was it. Why? Because constitutional law scholars, when they are writing about the constitutional system, not the political regime, the constitutional system, they use those terms, modern authoritarian and authoritarian, for instance, right? So what we wanted to see is that in those indexes, how are we? Right? So I understand your methodological concern here. In fact, we feel it as well, but we considered it that it will be legitimate criticism, but we cannot do this because then we have to write another book about why we do and do not, why consider, and yeah. But actually, what is interesting, and you asked my, but where I did I put it? Why we appreciated them were because now I'm opened something. So why we appreciated them were the fact that they, from their own perspective, they wanted to give a complete picture. And we never lost sight of their own perspective, right? So, for instance, we know that they have different methodologies, and I believe that based on their methodologies, their conceptual framework, they could come up with a feasible explanation of processes, right? So that's it. I don't challenge the idea that there are weaknesses. Of course, everything has weaknesses. Yeah, but I hope that I made it clear our methodological use and why we use them and why we didn't really consider them as, because now actually one thing, and this is not about the indexes, the use of indexes. For instance, when you read literature, the constitutional law literature, and they are writing that Hungary is a hybrid regime, right? Okay, based on the Freedom House, right? You are right. It is a hybrid regime, right? But then they sometimes they use like the hybrid regime in connection with fundamental rights. But now for that, Freedom House has another thing, right? The freedom score. And in the freedom score, we are like right now, Hungary is like partly free, but Poland is free. The internet score in our case, which is a different category, is also free. Why? In the other states, it is not free. Russia, Turkey is not free. Yeah, internet freedom, not free. Russia, Turkey, I'm just having a look at that. So this is also why we wanted to, because we felt that there might be a kind of limit, a kind of tunnel vision when in the literature, when you use the indexes. So if the indexes is not properly calculated or made, and then there is this narrowed vision of the use of the indexes. So we felt a discrepancy here, and that is why we did this type of analysis of the indexes. But thank you so much for this question. And this is very important. Yeah, what you asked. Thank you.
I think there are no more people for now, so I'll ask my questions. So thank you again, and I'm trying to situate myself because there was a lot of very deep discussions and very interesting discussions. And I'm trying to think about some of the relationships that you mentioned in the definition of illiberalism. So the first one is, you mentioned briefly that pragmatism was one of the bases of illiberalism in a certain way, if I followed you correctly. And I would like to understand how and what trend of pragmatism are you thinking of, or so what's the relationship between pragmatism and illiberalism? In relation to that as well, in the slide in which you tried to define illiberalism, there was a quick mention to authoritarian neoliberalism. And I was also curious about the relationship between illiberalism and authoritarian neoliberalism to define and to understand exactly this patchwork of this bricolage of definitions that are used in order to define the whole idea of illiberalism. And then the third and last one, and I'll stop here, is that the relationship of illiberalism and of illiberal constitutionalism with the debates on Latin American neo-constitutionalism, and if that's part of your agenda, and if you are dealing with this literature such as Gargarella and collaborators, because now Latin American neo-constitutionalism criticizes liberalism, but thinks of itself as democratic and as a way to deepen radical forms of democracy. So they wouldn't see themselves as illiberal in any sort of way, although they are criticizing liberalism. So I wonder if that's also part of the broader dialogues that you established.
Thank you. Very difficult questions. Wait, I just lost my thought here. When those authors, if I remember, but you will correct me, wrote about the Latin American constitutionalism, right? It was like a couple of years ago, right? So as I said, right now I don't know, because it is a fluid area what illiberalism is. And in this Oxford Handbook of Illiberalism, there would be chapters about illiberalism and South America. So that would be my answer. I know that it's not satisfactory. I don't research it. I haven't researched it. Once I wrote an article about the identity, and only then when I had a look at what is going on here, whether this other kind of term, the constitutional identity, not the one which I used here, but the other concept, could be applied in here as well. And then I made some research, and then that was when I met with this concept. I don't know. No one knows what the illiberalism is at this point. Everybody has an idea, and then I think further researches will tell. When we in the book, I didn't put it correctly here in the slides, but in the book we were like using illiberalism in parentheses, like illiberal, and we put a is in a parenthesis, because we were like, at that time we were like very uncertain about what it is, as everybody has been uncertain what it is, because now they are producing works about what it is, illiberalism. And what we understood about like illiberal or illiberalism at that point was that this is something else. It is less liberal in the sense of human rights. It is less liberal in the sense of democracy because of the human rights issues, and also it is less democratic. So it is just another vector, right? And so what we, Agnieszka and myself, what we didn't do, we didn't dig deep into the ideological foundations of our system. Why? Because we already read that there is no coherent ideology or philosophy behind this everything what is Orban or Kaczynski is doing in Hungary and Poland. And we also read that there are different scholars use, from their own perspective, they use different categorization. And one categorization was this pragmatism, this political pragmatism. One author, Hungarian author, called Viktor Orban as a pragmatist politic. who are using this kind of approaches. Others when they write about human rights, they say that it is not a liberal context anymore. It is a more communitarian. But then when you have a look at our constitutional change, Hungarian, in the fundamental law, you can see that in the very beginning, when it was actually adopted, it was like more or less fine, and these illiberal elements were put there later on. So I don't have an answer, actually, unfortunately. And as for authoritarian, what authoritarianism and illiberalism, and what is the connection, whether illiberalism is a denier of liberalism, is its antithesis, or it is like something which is within liberalism and it criticizes it. So it is for further research to determine the exact boundaries of these terms and what it means. But as I said, authors do not see illiberalism as a regime type, and so that is where they are. And sorry if I couldn't answer, but I think that it is good that we don't have answers for everything, because otherwise what we do, right?
That's great, thank you. So Magna is going to ask the next question.
Thank you, Tímea, very much for this interesting presentation. I'd like to learn more about you, how you analyze the relationship between the critical events and the politics and the spread of illiberal constitutionalism. For instance, did the pandemic as a national emergency affect the diffusion of the illiberal constitutionalism, or it's just help it to contain, to restrain this dissemination?
Thank you. Thank you, Magna, so much. I think that is also two things, whether it is contagious at all, this illiberal constitutionalism, and whether what the pandemic did with it, whether it helped to migrate from one country to another. What we see is that the illiberal constitutionalism, what this deterioration of everything without reaching the door of authoritarianism, it is contagious. If you consider, for instance, the Romanian Constitutional Court, now they are saying more or less the same thing that the Polish Constitutional Court is saying, basically that the Constitution is above the European law, and so they don't need to enforce it. Yeah, very briefly. So there are certain parts which could be contagious, yes. As for the pandemic, there are like debates also even in Hungary, because there is this opinion that the pandemic and all the lockdown and the emergency powers and stuff, they gave even more power to the executive in Hungary, and so that they abused in order to get more power. Now, I'm not sure about this, because they had power, they had constitutional majority. The only thing that the pandemic did and the emergency situation did was to accelerate the otherwise inevitable events, I think. And so yeah, so that's it. But as I said, illiberalism and the pandemic will be discussed in this new forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Illiberalism, as it is planned now.
Thanks, Tímea.
So do we have any last question So I think we're getting to an end, but I won't miss the opportunity then to ask you. So I think one last question that I had here, which is just in terms of curiosity. You ended your talk about the electoral situation in Hungary, and I would like to hear your prospects on that. So how do you, you're waiting for the elections to talk about that, but do you have any opinions on the current situation and what might happen? And so what are the current trends in terms of Hungarian politics? So that's my last question that I was curious, and it's not specifically connected to your talk, but it's just the opportunity to listen from someone from Hungary to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's very actual. And so what is going on right now is that finally the opposition is united. So it took them many years to get united. They tried to get united in the before the previous election, and they failed. And now they are united, and they try to act as a united opposition. And so that is for first. And the second, maybe their support basis. Based on the surveys, I try to read from everywhere, and I might miss something. So what was, they had this primary in which they organized a nationwide like primary election for certain positions, including the prime minister position, which is interesting because we don't elect prime minister because we have a parliamentary system, right? But then it was important for them because now they could unite behind one person. And I draw the attention of the one person here, the necessity, right? And yes, and according to the poll, the surveys, when they had this primary thing in autumn, they were like more supported than the Fidesz party. But then after that, they went back, and now it's like 50-50. But it depends on what you see, but more or less 50-50. And I also can read that this enthusiasm is like diminishing on the side of the opposition voters. I don't know, we can see, or we will see what happens. There are controversies about what they would do and can do in order to restore constitutionalism, because obviously that is the reason, that they want to get rid of the system, the prime minister and the party. But then the difficulty would be how to govern, because now the system is like very, very much like pro-Fidesz and their whatever they want to do, because they put their people in every critical position now for like many years, and universities are in their hands. Positions are there in their hands. We will have the election of the head of state, the president of the republic before. So they have the majority. So that is the problem. And then the constitutional court is also theirs. I'm oversimplifying it, okay? Actually, in the book, we also describe what the illiberal constitutional court is, and that they are serving two masters, not only the politics, but also some kind of constitutional values as well. And they need to balance some, they want to balance somehow. It is also in the book. What I'm trying to say is that this government has the people everywhere. So if the other side wins with less than constitutional majority, how they see it, it would be very difficult for them to govern, because they would have the checks and balances actually, right? And they will not be able to eliminate it because they would not have two-thirds majority. But then, especially in the last year, the second half of last year, there were a discussion about how to get rid of the constitution, the people in positions for which they are elected with two-thirds majority, with a simple majority. And so that is concerning that that you want to restore constitutionalism with non-constitutionalist tools and actions. On the other hand, there are also reasons behind that, because they are arguing that it is impossible and it is authoritarian and it doesn't consider nothing which is important. So we could and we must restore. And if we get the authorization from the people, even if it is not a two-thirds majority, we have to do it and we can do it. Now the discussion is like more or less, as I see it, is more or less that they try to find a solution. I don't know what they will do with this issue of the lack of constitutional majority, because I mean then comes the question of the transition, right? Whether you can build rule of law against the rule of law. Yeah, so, and that was answered by our constitutional court in the beginning of the 90s. They said that you cannot. But maybe now the politicians politicians will give another answer. I don't know that. But if they got supported by the people in their endeavor to restore constitutionalism with not really constitutionalist tools, then it would support our argument about the unbalanced constitutional identity, trading of values, and the need for a leader, right? So it does not necessarily mean that like illiberal constitutionalism would be over, as we understand the term. So.
Okay, so great. Thank you again, and it's wonderful to know that you are at UFMG. So for how long is your visit?
I arrived in April last year, and I have a 2 years long contract, and I'm looking forward to possibilities here, because I enjoy being here. I enjoy my classes with my students. And I got invitations to these kind of seminars, and I enjoy it too. So.
And please let us know your courses. I had a few students writing me what courses you're going to offer that they were interested in enrolling. So it's I think it would be wonderful if some of us could follow your lectures and your classes. Thank you again for your time. Thank you for being at UFMG, and please come back to political science again. And thank you, Magna, for the connection and the invitation, okay?
Thank you. If you invite me, I will be here. Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you, Magna. And thank you all of you who listened to us.
You are expecting your visit in the Center for Legislative Studies now.
So thank you everybody for following the seminar, and I just wish a nice weekend, and our next meeting is on the 11th of February with a presentation by Leo Avritzer and Lúcio Renault. So this is going to be the very last seminar of the academic year. Okay, so thank you everybody. Thank you, Tímea, and have a nice weekend, everybody.